Now that I've got my shop AC going, I decided to do this inside instead of outside where it's 95 degrees. Just fill the tractor bucket with some water and sit down and enjoy my rust removal. I was really surprised at how easily the saddle cleaned up. It only took me about 30 minutes to get the rust off of it, and the ways were in good condition. Really no rust present at all because it was protected from the table above it. The table, on the other hand, took considerably longer to get the rust off of it. I'm using Purple Power and Maroon Scotch Brite. The Purple Power doesn't really have any rust removing properties, but it seems to help with the wet sanding action because it's very slick. I used the Scotch Brite disc to clean up all of the non-critical outside surfaces. I didn't use it on any of the ways. I'm using the tapered gib to adjust the play out of the saddle. I found that using this technique let me get the adjustment dialed right in. That's the crossfeed nut for both the saddle and the table, and it's a pretty unique part, so I think if I ever have to repair that, I'll probably have to sleeve it. But it does appear to be in good condition and has very little backlash in both directions. This is one of the 3 hand wheels for the table, and pretty much the same deal, just run through the grits. I think I started off with like an 80 and I wind up at about 800, and then Scotch Brite, and then steel wool with some Brasso. The lathe makes this job really easy, and it's a fun part to do. I do have the bed of the lathe covered up with some towels to keep all that grit off of the ways. There is no really easy way to remove rust from a T-slot other than maybe sandblasting, but I didn't want to do that. So I made this little tool out of a strip of aluminum, some 3.5-inch quarter 20s, and a block of wood. And I'm using PSA 80 grit paper on the bottom of it to get it cleaned up. Seemed to work very well, although it doesn't get it totally clean. You have to still finish it with Scotch-Brite. If you apply enough pressure to Scotch-Brite, it will form to the channel and clean it up the rest of the way. And again, the same process with the table. I didn't hit any critical surface, no machine surface, just non-critical surfaces with the Scotch-Brite disc, and burned off that layer of rust, and hit it with 240 and hand Scotch-Brite after this to remove the marks left by the wheel. Here I'm just removing a few dings from the table with a hand file and then going back and knocking it down with the Scotch-Brite disc. Doing the initial rust removal with a wet sanding technique really helps to cut down on the amount of airborne debris. You can't see it in this shot, but I'm wearing a full face respirator and I have my air filtration system running. There is a lot of debris coming off of that Scotch-Brite wheel, and I think it's more the Scotch-Brite than it is the actual rust, but neither one of them's good. And I see a lot of guys doing this kind of work and they're not protecting themselves. Really, protect yourself. And overall, the table turned out to be in great condition. It had very little abuse, no machining marks. Just a few random dings, from tools getting dropped or parts or what have you, but overall in really great condition considering what it did look like. I needed a piece of material to use as a sanding block, so I planed down this piece of oak. I checked it with some calipers and it was dead flat. And then I coated it with some Johnson paste wax. That won't stop the water from absorbing into the block, but it will slow it down and keep it truer longer, I guess, is the point. This is a one-use deal, so if you wanted to use it again, you'd have to true it up. Might as well just plane another piece and start over, use it the same day. So you can see I'm pretty much only going in one direction. I'm trying to keep all of the marks going the same way. And right there at the end of the table, I found that I had a low spot. It was about 2 inches from the end, so it's not really critical, and it's not really that low. I didn't actually measure it, but it's only a few thousandths. But it was a little bit more difficult to remove the rust that was right there at the end because it was recessed down in a little depression. So took a little more work to get that off, but in general, the table is very flat. I'm using Purple Power at full strength, so you have to be careful to keep the surface wet all the time so it doesn't etch the part. You can see I rub my hands over it occasionally and just keep everything wet. And here I've got that Scotch-Brite really squished with an old paint paddle down into the T-slot, and it really helps to form the Scotch-Brite to the T-slot and get that remaining gook out. And for the finish pass, I switched to using just water to help remove any remaining Purple Power residue and just leveling out all of the surfaces so it looks more uniform with the Scotch-Brite. I need to remake the table lock grub. You can see here that I've got a lathe tool holder and the saddle grub so I can get the radial arm saw set up at the correct angle. And I've got the wheel going the wrong direction. If you notice, it's riding up on the wheel a little bit, but no big deal. If you go back and look at some of the earlier footage, you can see minor damage on one of the tableways. I'm thinking what happened was this grub was much too small and somehow it got jammed and they had to pull the gib out or something, and it got stuck against the way and it caused some damage. Not a big deal. I just took a file and dressed it a little bit. I really don't know how it happened, but it did. And the only thing I can figure is that this was way too short. As you can see, it could easily get cocked. So I just made a new one and made it a little bit longer. You can see the saddle's working nicely and has very little backlash. I've already got the stop screw on the back side, and here you can see I'm doing the same procedure like I did with the saddle, just wiggling it around and sliding it back and forth to find the play and dialing in the adjustment. Here I'm backing off the stop screw in the back so that I can adjust the end screw in a little bit more to make the adjustment on the gib tighter, and just keep doing that process. It took a while to get the table dialed in. The saddle was really easy. After getting these end caps installed, I found that there was a slight amount of interference between the bottom of the cap and the top of the saddle, so it was limiting the table travel. I had to go back and loosen those bolts up and raise up the cap just slightly. It was thousandths of an inch, but I think something else happened when I did that, which was to kind of preload the crossfeed screw into the crossfeed nut, so it's putting upward pressure on the nut, kind of bowing the screw across there to some degree. I don't know how much deflection there is there, but there is some, because I could tell that everything tightened up a little bit more after I made that adjustment. So I think Rockwell intended for it to be that way, to kind of preload the screw and get all of the as much as possible backlash or movement out of the crossfeed nut. I thought a good place to start with tramming the head was just to raise the knee up until the table made contact with the spindle. I've got the column bolts loose, just squared it off and then snug those back up, and that gave me a good starting point. You can see here that I've remade the original drawbar with a 3/4 hex nut on the end. The original nut was 7/8 and would not allow the quill to travel down. This allows it to pass through the pulley, and I get the full 2.5 inches of travel on the quill. I will say that getting the head trammed in was a little bit of a challenge, just because of the sequence of tightening the bolts. As I was tightening, I was shifting it left and right, and so that was a little bit complicated to figure out. But in the end, it looks like I got it to less than half a thou, which I'm very happy with. Thanks for watching.